Say good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Say it's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
All right, what song are you singing tonight?
Blue skies and rainbows.
Okay, you ready?
Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven. Oh, Lord, I can't see when my Lord is know that Jesus is well and alive today. Makes his home in my heart. Never will I be all alone since he promised me that we never would part. We're sitting down in the river to pray.
As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown, the Lord show me the way. Oh, brothers, let's go down, let's go down, come on down, come on, brothers, let's go down, down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown, good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sisters, let's go down, let's go down, come on down, come on, sisters, let's go down, down in the river to pray.
You want to come up here? Come on up here, Charles. We're going to sing a song real quick. Come on up here. Come on stage. Okay, let's get you on stage and sing it together. You can start it out. Ready? Charlie's going to start. Ready, Charlie, go. I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly on the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir! All right. Thank you. Gentle shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. Gentle shepherd, come and feed us, for we need your strength from day to day. happy moments roll. When Jesus showed his smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul.
All right. Appreciate everyone being with us this evening. Forgive me if I take a couple of extra sips of water. I'm starting to get a little bit of a scratchy throat. So, last week we talked about the first few verses of James chapter 5. And this week we're going to be covering 7 through 12. Before we get started, just in context, I always like to have good context before we go through these verses. The first thing that James says in in verse 7 is, "Be patient, therefore." And the "therefore," as we talked about before, is a word that is always indicative that we're drawing a conclusion on something that was previously said. Now, that may be immediately before or several chapters before, but it's always going to be drawing a conclusion. And last week, in the first few verses of chapter 5, we talked about some of the indications or warning signs that individuals may be living with more faith or trust in their wealth. And as we went through that, we talked about how there could potentially be some individuals that would mistreat others due to their wealth in order to get ahead, in order to have financial gain. They may, do things that we wouldn't condone in order to get ahead, and doing that to those that are less fortunate. And in this context, I think that's what we're talking about. So when he says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers," I think he's going to be talking about to these individuals that are maybe being mistreated, that are going through trials or hardships due to some of the things that we talked about last week. And that would kind of fall in line with what we talked about last week because of the things that he outlined that the rich would do to those that are poor in taking advantage of them. So, as we always do, we're going to read through the entire chapter, and then we'll go back and start picking it apart verse by verse here. So, starting in verse 7 and working through verse 12, it says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no." So, back up to verse 7, starting out. He's saying, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." And this section, as is titled here at the top, "Endure to the Finish Line," is very reminiscent of what we talked about from chapter 1. The very first thing that James talked about in chapter 1 was enduring trials, enduring challenges, and in doing so, we talked about lessons that we could learn from going through those things and enduring. And so looking back at that a little bit, I think he tells us to look at those trials with joy. And the reason we were to do that was because we can learn lessons from those trials, we can grow in our faith, we can gain perspective. And then he's bringing this up again towards the end of this letter in this chapter 5. And I think when we look at when an author brings a topic up over and over again, it should point us to really paying attention to it, because if they bring it up over and over again, then it must have been very important to them. And in this book of James, he talks about that. That's something that comes up over and over. And so in this first section, Endure to the Finish Line, he's going to give us a couple of things that he thinks that we need to be doing as we endure. And so patience is the first thing that he brings up. Be patient, therefore. And he's saying, if you're being mistreated, again, in the context of what we had just talked about in the previous verses, endure and be patient. And he repeats that multiple times. So it must be important to him. And he says, until the coming of the Lord. And I think that most of us would recognize this. The coming of the Lord, this finish line is, Jesus coming back. And Tim has several references that on the right-hand side at the top here. And this is referenced 300 plus times, he says, in the New Testament and in Scripture. And so it must have been very important for them to be thinking about this context and this topic as James is giving them this instruction. And so James is saying, endure to this finish line, endure until Jesus comes back. And it's important for them because they don't know when this is going to be happening. So it's a constant reminder for them. And in the notes on the right, he has a note that says, some say that the apostles believed that they would be living when the Lord returned, but they did not know, about the time. And that's referenced in Matthew chapter 24 when Jesus says, not even I know the time when the Son is going to be returning. And so it's an important point. And he says, be patient and establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Again, reminding them how important this is. And then he gives an example of a farmer. And he says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. I don't know how many of you grew up on farms or grew up in farming. I can't imagine it would be a great majority of us. I think that kind of lifestyle is not adopted as often anymore as what it once was, but I know some of us have. My brother-in-law, who lives in Paducah, he farms his family's farm, and he's done that for several years. He's gotten out of it for a good reason, because it's really hard to make a living as a farmer. But he farmed several hundred acres, and I feel like every time I would go up on holiday or on vacation to go see them, during that period of time when he was farming, he was constantly talking about waiting in some form or fashion. So we're about to approach spring. Well, for a farmer, in the spring, that's planting season, but you can't just go out and plant anytime you want to. You have to wait until the conditions are just right. It can't be too wet, can't be too dry. You can't plant it too soon because you might have a frost. So you have to plant it just the right time. Well, then you have to hope that you get rains, like he references here in verse 7. And then you have to hope that there's not a drought during the summers. And then you have to wait till harvest. You have to let that crop be raised so that it has its highest yield. And I remember talking to him about, well, have you started harvesting yet? And he's like, no, we're still waiting, still waiting. And then it's hurry up and get everything done as quickly as you can. And I think that most of the people that James was talking to here would have recognized the references that he was making. It can be difficult for some of us to understand all the nuances, and specifics about that, but I think that we can understand the concept of waiting And it's important to be patient. Tim gives an example of marathon training. And we've talked about that, he is a runner, he's a marathoner. And in the example of a marathon, you can't start the race too quickly. You have to pace yourself because you recognize that you're going to be running for a long period of time. And right now, I think about how the Winter Olympics are on. And so we see a lot of this right now. We can see it on TV. And I think about, in the context of stating that something is a marathon, not a sprint, I think about the difference between like a speed skater that you see on the ice, where maybe they're racing for maybe 500 meters or 1,000 meters. And these high-class athletes may only be on the ice for a couple of minutes in a sprint. However, you have in opposition to that a biathlon or cross-country skiing where they're competing for a long period of time. And if you would place a speed skater in another event where they have to compete for a long period of time, they might not be able to do that because they haven't trained for endurance. And I think that that's part of the concept that James is trying to relay to us, is that it in the context of a race, in that example of a race, or in the example of the farmer, that being patient and waiting is an advantage to you. It can help you to develop more endurance. It can help you learn how to go through hardship and challenges, just as we've talked about in this. And so he's saying, hold on here. Hold on until the coming of the Lord. And I think that in the second thing that he talks about, establish your hearts, James is calling on us to keep our eyes focused on what's most important here. He's calling on us to remember why we're waiting. We're waiting on the coming of the Lord. And again, the disciples talked about that in their teaching after Jesus, ascended. Jesus talked about that. And so be patient. It requires patient endurance unto the end. And in the context here, especially if we're going through trials, if we're being mistreated, we're going through challenges, we have to develop that patience and that endurance. So be patient for the coming of the Lord. And then as we keep our eyes on the prize, as James is telling us to do, again, that was the very first thing that he talked about in James. If you recall, I'm going to read several verses here. But in James, going back to chapter 1, just as a reminder for us, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness," or endurance. "And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And then in the next few verses, he talks about if we lack wisdom, we need to ask God for that. So if we're going through a trial, if we're going through something, we need to ask God, what am I supposed to learn from this? And then he talks about asking in faith and not doubting. So if we're going to ask for God for help, we have to ask not doubting, knowing that, again, like we talked about in that very early lesson, the example of what that looks like to ask in faith. It means, if you're praying for rain, carry an umbrella, right? Assume that what you're praying for has already been started by the Lord. That good work has already been started by the Lord. And then he talks about not being double-minded. He talks about let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. So again, that's what we just talked about last week a little bit, that the lowly brother can boast when he comes into trials or challenges because his faith is in Christ already. He doesn't have anything else to put his faith into. And then it says, the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. And so in retrospect to the lowly brother, you know, the rich will be humiliated in this context because they're putting their faith in something other than Jesus. They're putting their faith in their wealth and in their worldly wealth, and it's going to pass away. And so then in verse 12, the final thing he says that I think sums it up really well, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Blessed is the man who has developed patience, like we're talking about. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. The next verse that I want to go to is going to be in Romans. Both of these next ones are going to be in Romans. This is in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. Very similarly, Paul here, talking about going through trials, going through challenges, he says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And so Paul here is talking about how all of these things build on one another. That suffering produces endurance, endurance, character, character, hope. All of these things build on one another. It's a process, right? Like we talked about, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. This is a ongoing process that we're going to go through. And then the last one, Romans 8. Romans 8. And this is going to be in verses 12 through 18. And here Paul is talking about being heirs with Christ. And in the very last verse, verse 18, he says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. So James and Paul here, both in unison, are saying and pointing to the same principle, that what we can expect to receive at the end of this race, at the end of this marathon, our lives, even though we're going to go through challenges, even though we're called to endure, what we are to receive at the end of the race is so incredible and awesome that it's not even worth comparing the two, right? What we are to receive at the end is so much better. It's going to be so worth it. So hold on. Be patient. Endure. Establish your hearts. Excuse me. So maybe a more practical example. I don't know if this will resonate with any of you. It did with me. It's the first thing I thought of. But I have a mortgage. And Annie and I bought our home a couple years ago. So we are, 2 years into 30 years. And if you want to get really depressed, just look at the mortgage statement that your mortgage company sends to you, especially if you're really early on. And mine, I don't know if yours do this, but mine like to send me a really lovely pie chart, okay? And my pie chart is made up of one little bitty sliver about like this, okay? And that's the principal of the mortgage that my amount that I pay every single month goes to. It's like this much. And then the whole other aspect is nothing but interest and fees. And so I do know that eventually, in this process of paying this mortgage, eventually that small little piece that goes to the principal is going to get larger and larger and larger and larger and larger, right? And so in this example, the goal is to get the mortgage paid off, to own my own home, to have no debt associated with it. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. And I'm sure that in the process of that, of paying my monthly mortgage, there's going to be months where my AC goes out, or I have to pay a plumber to come fix something else, or a natural disaster is going to cause something else to go wrong. Maybe I got to get a roof replaced or my gutters replaced or something like that, like we just experienced over the last few weeks. However, with that being said, I've never talked to anyone who has actually achieved that goal of paying off their home that has said, that's not really worth it. You should probably just refinance and keep on paying debt, right? Like, I don't think any of us would say that, or at least not the sane ones in the room. And so, I know that that's a funny example, but it does hold some truth in this context of enduring to the finish line. And, think about how much more great, how much more awesome, infinitely more so, that our salvation is in this context. That the race that we're running in our faith, when we get to the end and we attain that, how much more awesome that will be than me talking about owning my own home in 28 more years, right? So, again, enduring to the finish line, being patient, establishing our hearts, enduring all those challenges. Now, the second part here, talking about staying on course. Now, I'm going to tell one of Tim's stories. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, I'm using Tim's outline, I'm using his podcast to kind of go through these lessons. And, as Tim tells some of his stories, I think about things that happen in my own life that I can use to provide a same example. But the story that I'm going to tell is Tim's story. And I think it really is going to be good to help us go through this topic of staying on course. So Tim tells a story, and again, most of you know he was a runner, big-time runner, does marathons, half marathons. He's done dozens of them. And he was preparing for a race, and he was doing a half marathon, so 13.1 miles. And he talks about in the preparation for this race, he had decided to set a PR, a personal record for the race that he was about to run. And he has a watch that keeps track of time for him, and it has a GPS tracker on it. So when he starts the race, he knows and understands what pace he has to meet at each mile marker of the race, right? And he starts the race, and he's feeling good, and he gets to the pace point where he should be at the first mile marker, and he looks at his watch, first mile marker should be coming up, and he says, oh, yep, there it is right there. He's staying on pace, he's staying on track. Well, at some point in time, going forward, he starts looking at his watch, and he's recognizing that there should be a mile marker coming up, but there's no mile marker in sight. And he's not the only one running. There's lots of people running in the race, and so he's just following everybody else running. And he says that eventually he gets to the point where he thinks something is off. He knows something is off because he's running the right pace. The GPS is correct. It says he should have reached the next mile marker, but it's just not coming. And at the end of the race, he endures. He finishes, right, just like everybody else does. But there was a recognition that at the beginning of the race, there was a vehicle that was leading the individuals at the front of the race out, and that vehicle had veered off course. It had taken the wrong track, and it had caused every individual in the race to run farther than they were supposed to. So you can imagine how frustrating it was for him to be on pace to set this PR, this personal record, only to recognize that he had been led astray. He had been led off course by whoever it was that was driving this vehicle. And so now in these next couple of verses, in this context and in this heading of staying on course, James is going to provide us a couple of warning signs that maybe we're getting off course, okay? And so in verse 9, the very first thing he says is, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. And I think the lesson here is that if we're not solely focused on the task at hand, on the race, right? If we're not focused on that, maybe we're not showing the right kind of patience that James has instructed us to previously. Maybe we're grumbling against one another, against our brethren, which James talked about in chapter 4. If you recall, he says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And he says it's your passions that are at war within you. And so if we're not focused, again, at the race at hand, and we're not being patient, it's easy to maybe lash out at others if we get distracted and we're not staying focused because things aren't going well for us. Maybe we're going through these trials, these hardships. And so James is saying, don't grumble. And Tim has a reference to Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, where he says in that section, do all things without grumbling or complaining. And then at the end of that section, he says, hold firmly to the word of life. Then on the day of Christ's returns, I will be proud that I did not run the race in vain. And so we have to remember to stay focused, that we have a task at hand, we have a goal. And so we don't want to be running in vain. We don't want to be running for no reason or get distracted by other things. And then the next thing that he says is, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And he gives us some examples there in these references. Tim does. And then in verse 11 it says, behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Now, if you want to talk about an individual who had to endure, who had to go through challenges, Job would be a pretty good character study to look at in the Old Testament. If you recall that story, Satan was essentially allowed to go and tempt Job with anything and everything. And he had everything taken away from him in his life. His family, his wealth, his goods, his home, everything. Everybody betrayed him, et cetera, et cetera. And Tim has several verses listed out about some of the responses that Job had when he was confronted by different individuals in his life. And so in Job 1, 21 through 22, it says, in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with cursing him. In chapter 2, verse 10, it says, shall we receive good and not evil? And then it says, in all of this, Job did not sin. Again, he did not sin. In chapter 13, verse 15, in a response to an individual, Job says, let come what may, I will hope in him, being God. And then the last one in chapter 19, there's a response from Job that says, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand on earth. He recognizes why he is running his race. He recognizes why he is enduring, because he's put his hope and his faith and his trust in Jesus, who he knows will stand at the end. And so even though Job went through all of these different things, he endured, he trusted God, he was patient. All of the things that James is telling us that we should be aspiring to. And then the last two verses here, or the last verse, verse 12, he says, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. And this was something brand new to me. I did not know this until I got to this study, but when it says do not swear either by heaven or by earth, it alludes to the Jewish practice of taking oaths by different things, either by heaven or by hell in this context here. And it says, and their level of truthfulness was determined by the relative holiness of the object of their oaths. And, I'll be honest, so much of this stuff goes completely over my head. Tim, as most of you know, is such a smart guy. He has such a knack for pulling out this information and this context, but it helps us to understand the scripture better. And so he says here that his mentor, Marlon Connolly, called this verbal finger crossing. And if you remember from when you were little, when you were playing with your friends and you were going to go make a promise a lot of times, right? You'd put your fingers behind your back and you do this and you're like, oh yes, absolutely, I'm going to do that. And then they turn around and walk away and you go, like my fingers crossed, right? And essentially, James is saying here, you don't have to do that. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And Tim has a note here. It says, patience and endurance are not manifested by grand verbal promises or gestures. You don't have to use your mouth to make these promises or gestures and take oaths that you're going to do something. You just live your life out quietly, endure, right? And that's what he says here. True patience and endurance are epitomized by quiet talk that follows through and endures under trial. And so in summary of this section here, enduring to the finish line and staying on course, it's not meant to be easy, right? I think most of us can recognize that. Life is not meant to be easy. But as the saying goes, anything worthwhile doesn't come easy anyway. This life is meant to reveal our strength. It's meant to develop character. It's meant to develop resilience. And as characterized by James, and as he describes it, by patient endurance, following through with what you say, living it out, being a doer. And then I think James chapter 1, verse 12, to finish, summarizes everything exceptionally well in the context of enduring to the finish line and staying on course. It says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him." And I know that is our hope and our honest prayer for all of us here, is that we would remain steadfast under trial so that we would receive the crown of life in the end. Appreciate you guys tonight. Be back with us next week, be the very last lesson, and then you won't have to listen to me at least for another quarter if somebody invites me back. Thanks.